Nick is going to talk to us about the role of the regulatory frameworks, and then Robbie is going to talk about national policy statements for the heartland. So first of all, Nick, over to you.
Thank you.
Keep it tight.
I'll do my best.
No, do better than that.
Well, happily enough, I think I've got the opportunity to do that. I'll apologise in advance. You've got a couple of presentations from lawyers, so unlike Jonathan, these slides are a little bit more wordy, fewer pictures. But we were commissioned originally to look at regulatory frameworks across the whole suite of utilities infrastructure. An awful lot of that is not transport. So I can skip through those ones quite quickly and get us back onto time with a bit of luck. And we can probably skip over most of this as well because we know where we are and what we're doing. This was setting the scene to the report that we did. The main thing to take away from this is we identified that to deliver the places, the productivity, the improvements that people need, there is also a need for some sort of wider strategic infrastructure investment across all sectors. Otherwise, there simply won't be the kit in the roads connected to the houses for people to benefit from. And so they won't move here and they won't do things here. So we were commissioned a few months ago to take a look at the opportunities and the barriers that the existing regulatory frameworks pose to the development of new infrastructure. We looked at each of the regulatory regimes in each of the sectors. We engaged with several of the stakeholders involved, the local authorities, the LEPs, the regulators, the utility providers themselves, central government. And if you want a spoiler and you can't be bothered to read the whole of our report, I don't blame you, it's quite long. Everybody thought they were doing a really good job, but everybody else that they dealt with could benefit from taking a wider view. And we tried to go a bit beyond that and identify a number of recommendations which EEH can pursue jointly with government and with the infrastructure providers and with the regulators. And a number of those have been taken forward in the call to arms for the budget mentioned earlier. One of the particular ones we noted was there is quite a disconnect between the different sectors of the utilities. And as Naomi mentioned earlier, policies don't just land in a linear fashion, they land in a real place and they have to join up. And that doesn't seem to be happening in the way that would be most helpful to deliver productivity across the corridor. There is a need to streamline these conversations. And we suggested some form of strategic infrastructure delivery board set up with government to agree governance, assessment, coordination, all those things, the required infrastructure. And the proposed joint business delivery unit is an iteration of that, potentially leading with central governments with this wider engagement. We thought it'd be very important here to be clear about what it is that the Heartland's looking for, what the ambitions are, what the objectives are. And again, that goes back to the data collection that Naomi mentioned earlier. The main overall challenge that we noted, though, a lot of people beforehand thought it was that the planning system was the main barrier, and there are certainly issues there, and I think Robbie will come on to those. But the main impediment that most of the players seemed to think was involved was the price control mechanism that they're each under. Most utilities are in more or less monopolies, and they're in price-regulated industries. They have to essentially have clarity that they're going to be able to charge for a new bit of kit before they're going to be prepared to put it, to build it and to go for it. And each of the utilities has a slightly different arrangement that don't look at each other. And when we first flagged this, one of the initial pieces of feedback from government was don't try to change the timelines or suggest that they get joined up with each other because that will never happen. However, more stability, more of a long-term view, we think will help to deliver both the big strategic projects, but also the last mile projects. And we understand the NIC is now it's conducting a review of regulations more generally and see how some sort of adaptive regulation could be managed. But we think there's also a role here for the Heartland to pull things together and act as a lead in this area, and particularly in engaging with the NIC. Another area that was regularly raised was, well, how do you fund and finance things? Can we identify some sort of variation of tax increment financing, some sort of pooling of retained business rates when that comes forward? But utilities really needed to have some sort of understanding how can they guard against the risk here. And again, this is sort of developed further since, and the Major Scheme Development Fund being called for at the moment goes some way towards this. So far as the planning's concerned, again, the timeframes here are all different. This is one of the key issues, particularly the different disconnect between the regulatory frameworks, which I'll mention shortly, but also the land use planning permission framework, the timescales for local plans and so on, the look ahead that people have to have for when houses are going to be provided. And potentially there is room here for more certainty across the whole piece. One of the ideas we flagged, but it doesn't seem to go forward particularly, is that we can take some of the better things from EU regulations even as we leave. There is a process for what's called projects of common interest on the Trans-European Energy Infrastructure Regulations, which actually set down abbreviated timescales and a clearer process for projects that are identified in this particular way. And we thought, well, actually, there's something we can pick from here. Can we identify projects that are beneficial for the heartland that can have an abbreviated process like this? Could potentially there be relaxations on some of the restrictions on permitted development rights? Utility providers, other infrastructure providers do benefit from quite substantial PD rights, so they don't require to go for planning permission for everything. And there's scope here potentially for an area to be designated as an area where more utility provision is required, and therefore some of the restrictions that currently exist on PD to be relaxed there. But particularly, though, planning policy is steered by central government. Local planning authorities have to work within the national planning policy framework. And there have been encouraging signs recently with MPPF2 and indications from government that actually they like what's being done in areas like Oxfordshire's joint statutory strategic framework, and so that they will be allowing some more time to work things through. There are ways that the MPPF works that don't work particularly well with joint policies, and to see what can be done there. So we need to watch that space. Now moving to various different sections in our report which dealt with the various different utilities. And as I promised earlier, these are mostly not to do with transport, so we can skip through them quite quickly if we want to get back onto time. I think the main things to pick up, though, here, I mean, the headline things were perhaps the different time periods we're working with, so that people understand the issues involved here. But also some of the areas where we thought there could be a benefit. So energy generally works with 8-year financial control periods. It does, however, recognise Ofgem that this can be a hindrance to bringing forward development, and has a mechanism for dealing with strategic wider works which would straddle over a boundary. And that gives an opportunity there for working together with different sectors potentially. It's something that can be adapted elsewhere. Can we adapt that mechanism to bring forward works that are potentially of heartland-wide benefits? Water works with 5-year management periods, which are set within 25-year periods. And their price control periods also are different. But in the context of water, there is something called a strategic priority statement, which Ofwat has to work with. And at the moment, this essentially focuses on environmental matters. And there's a particular concern that we had that Ofwat essentially is neutral, deliberately neutral, between the delivery of new infrastructure and demand restriction measures, or measures to improve efficiency. So it doesn't really matter if there are new pipes, new reservoirs, or if the water companies take steps to reduce the leakage. Either way, if there's a similar amount of benefit to the end user, they're fine. Now that's potentially fine across the whole of the country, and probably appropriate across the whole country. But in an area where you are looking to put in place additional infrastructure, we thought potentially there's an opportunity there for that to be different and for that to be adjusted so that more infrastructure is encouraged. Ofwat also has a different price control mechanism for large-scale projects, currently the Thames Tideway, new sewer underneath River Thames. And again, there's potential there to explore whether some iteration of this could be developed for the heartland. Flood risk management works on 6-year cycles. It's slightly different from some of the other ones because it's more public sector focused. But we thought here again there's a role for EEH to be involved in drawing things together and saying, well, look at what's happening in this area of development, look what's happening in this area of development, through some sort of inclusion in the regional structures that are involved there. Telecoms is different from some of the other regulated industries because it's more of a mature market, it's more of an open market than, say, water or energy, and Ofcom relies more on competition to deliver the consumer benefits and new infrastructure. And at the time, we noted that a telecoms review was planned for summer 18, that's going ahead. One area that was highlighted by the NIC was that if there was a regulatory mechanism to ensure that data about the location of infrastructure networks was shared between other network operators and utilities, then you could take a cross-sector system level review and avoid potentially the energy company cutting into the water pipe and cutting off water supply and delaying the connection of more additional electricity resource. And I know one of our sponsors is providing material and sort of setting out, well, actually here is a tool to identify where everything is. And we feel here there is an area for regulators to go further, to encourage greater innovation, to encourage that sort of product to be brought forward. And again, a role potentially for EEH to bring those various bodies together. I mentioned earlier that the smaller developments are consented, well, they are permitted development. Larger developments by utilities require planning permission to be determined by local authorities, and so each local planning authority sets its own local plan. There is already a lot of good work being done by Oxfordshire and by Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, looking at a wider strategic basis for their plans. And we consider there is a role for EH to talk with its member authorities to say, well, actually, where can we go further than this? What is the role for joining up more widely? Where will that work? And then we did go into potentially the development of a national policy statement, but I don't want to take off too much time by giving Robbie's talk in one slide, so I'll skip over that more quickly. So our conclusions, essentially, we felt that there's a strong role for a body like EEH to bring forward all the different interested parties to provide an integrated infrastructure approach and clarity about the Heartland's ambitions and objectives to central government and also to private investors. And some sort of joint delivery body could be formally established with the identification of named champions for each infrastructure sector. Those could bring departments and parties together. There is potentially a role for new approaches to infrastructure investment as being proposed in the call to arms for the budget, because central government does have a role in encouraging more private investment through its industrial strategy. And we thought EEH could have a role here in assessing the various different financing models, what can work for this locality. There's also an opportunity to make small changes during the planning process to help streamline and improve decision making. And EEH is in a good place to be able to make the case, provide evidence of the infrastructure needs at a pre-planning stage across the whole of the Heartlands, and also to continue to work with regulators and utility providers in order to work out what the growth scenarios ought to be. And then as regulations go through their next iterations, we move into the next asset management periods, however they're called, the regulatory frameworks are updated, and there is a role here for EEH to be talking to the policymakers when they're setting the goals for the regulators to say, well, this is the sort of infrastructure investment that we need across our corridor, so these are the sort of policies that we're encouraging you to put in place to get the regulators to work to, so that the infrastructure providers will be incentivized to provide them. And finally, we thought there's a specific role here to seek further policy support for the Heartland and for the economic infrastructure that's required here. And we thought potentially there is a role for a national policy statement to encourage regulators to take account of the need for advanced delivery of strategic infrastructure, not just for the big things, but also beneficial for the smaller things.
Nick, thank you, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, I'm going to talk about, I think, quite an exciting idea that I've been developing with Martin and colleagues in the Alliance about what more central government can do, because I firmly believe that the full potential of the Heartland just will not be realised unless central government does more to really embed its support for the concept in policy. We all know governments come and go. and this is intended to recognise that and really put in place something that's really powerful and sends a really strong message to everybody, local authorities, investors, project promoters, that this concept is here to stay. It's not just a good idea this year and then government will have other ideas next year. So I need to tell you a little bit about national policy statements first. They've been developed under this regime we have for nationally significant infrastructure projects called NSIPs, and this is a regime that came in 2008 and has been successfully used to give planning and many other consents for big infrastructure schemes like Hinkley Point C, Tideway Tunnel in London now being built, and many other energy, water, transport and waste schemes as set out on the slide. There is the ability also to use the regime, not yet being taken up for commercial and business projects, and you can now have a little bit of housing as part of it. But this is essentially a special planning regime for big infrastructure that is nationally significant. What you get at the end of the day is your planning permission is actually called a development and consent order. The key thing is that national policy statements are the backbone of this regime, because when it was set up in 2008, government said, well, actually, we need to be much clearer on policy. We've had lots of long public inquiries where arguments were what government policy was on X or Y. Let's deal with that by setting out in advance what our policy is in relation to certain infrastructure sectors. So we have now a number of national policy statements in place. There are 6 NPSs in relation to energy. For example, there's one on nuclear power. There's one on ports, there's one on national networks, which is railways, roads and rail freight interchanges. There's one on hazardous waste, one on wastewater, and most recently, some of you might be aware of, the airports NPS was approved by the House of Commons and designated, adopted essentially, by government. More are planned. Government recently consulted on a draft water resources national policy statement and is expected to consult soon on a draft nuclear waste geological disposal NPS. Now, these NPSs are extremely powerful things, and the slide's quite small there, but essentially under the legislation, the Secretary of State has a very wide power to put in place national policy statements, setting out national policy in relation to one or more specified descriptions of development. And it then sets out what an NPS may in particular do, and it can, in effect, in relation to the sector it's dealing with, set out the amount, type or size of infrastructure that government thinks is appropriate, set out criteria to be used in deciding on location of infrastructure, set out one or more locations as suitable for infrastructure. Some of these NPSs are location specific. So, for example, the airports one I mentioned earlier concludes that the right place for a new runway in the southeast of England is Heathrow. So that's an example of a locationally specific one. The national networks one is not location specific, it's quite general. And it also deals with how you assess the impacts of infrastructure and how you deal with mitigation. Crucially, this is the point at the bottom of the slide, that where there is a national policy statement in force for a particular infrastructure sector, when a project comes forward for consent under this special planning regime I mentioned earlier, the Secretary of State must decide the application in accordance with the national policy statement. So it's not just like any other planning policy statement. It's very strong in terms of saying that that is the key test as to whether the scheme should get consent. And this sends a very strong message to investors and developers that if they develop a scheme that's in accordance with the NPS, they are more likely than not to get consent. And that is a hugely valuable aspect of the regime. The Planning Act sets out a formal process for designating national policy statements. A draft is published, there's consultation on the draft, there's parliamentary scrutiny of the draft, normally by the relevant select committee. So, for example, the Transport Select Committee did national networks and more recently Heathrow, the airport's NPS. And then the House of Commons gives its approval, and then the Secretary of State is then able to designate it by putting it in place legally. And there's also, this is important, I'll come back to this, there's also a formal process for what happens if the same or another Secretary of State then wants to suspend or review the NPS. They can't just do it, they have to go through a process. So there's a process of putting in the policy and then if it needs to be reviewed as well. What could a national policy statement for the heartland say? Well, if you look at the NIC's report, that highlights a number of big infrastructure projects that certainly would be within this infrastructure regime I've mentioned. So East-West Rail and the Expressway are the two most obvious ones, but there are also could be several others, for example, energy and utilities and also water projects. There's lots of existing work, of course, done by the Alliance and others here that could be used as the evidence base for a national policy statement, and therefore, we wouldn't be asking government to start from scratch. And I think the MPS could, as I set out on the slide there, it could set out the need and in principle support for the infrastructure in the heartland. It could set out any wider government policies that are appropriate and apply to that infrastructure. It could set out, deal with impacts of the infrastructure. It could contain clear and concise policy tests and assessment principles that can be robustly met when individual projects come forward for consent. And crucially, it could also set out in terms of policy and contain policy that would be a material consideration in relation to Town and Country Planning Act applications. So for those projects that aren't infrastructure projects and don't have to go through this special regime, you can still have a national policy statement that not only informs the consent for those projects, but also contains very material considerations for normal planning applications. So I think this is something that needs to be given serious consideration in terms of what more government can do to support the heartland. And I conclude with just these benefits, really, of an MPS for the heartland. First, I think an MPS would powerfully embed the importance of the heartland and the ARC into national planning policy. And this is the key thing, for a significant period of time. It would provide long-term policy certainty and commitment from central government, as I mentioned in starting. This is, I think, really, really important when you've got a 25-year vision to be delivered. We want to be clear the policy is going to be in place for a reasonable period of time. I think it would provide robust alignment at the regional level, because government's saying, well, all these local authorities, you've got to do joint plans and things. And I frankly think that it's fanciful to think that's going to happen across the whole heartland. I think it's just too difficult. And government can do it instead through the MPS. They can bind things together at regional level in relation to the infrastructure that's required, and that can then feed down into non-infrastructure planning decisions. Thirdly, I say that an MPS would make sure there was a coordinated approach to the planning and delivery of the strategic infrastructure that the heartland needs. Fourthly, an MPS would provide a strengthened framework for strategic infrastructure working alongside the local development plan. And fifthly, as I mentioned earlier, the MPS would be the determining factor when deciding applications for development consent orders for these big projects like East-West Rail and the Expressway. These MPSs have legal effect. They have to be used in deciding applications for development consent orders, and as I say, they can also be a material consideration when deciding normal planning applications. And finally, and this is a concluding point really, I think the MPS would provide clarity and certainty for decision makers, so government, scheme promoters, investors, and communities, and local government as well, on what is government policy on the nationally significant projects that are going to be needed in the heartland, and the way in which they should be dealt with through the planning process, providing that certainty that actually we all need to know where we're going really. And I conclude that the National Networks MPS is helpful, but I don't think it's going to be helpful enough when it comes to taking forward East-West Rail and the Expressway, something much more specific, setting out why those projects are needed for the heartland, what the benefits are going to be, what the impacts are going to be, how the impacts should be assessed and dealt with like other MPSs. That, I think, would be a real boon. And so Martin and I have been talking to central government. There's more work to be done. Naturally, they don't feel too cheerful about doing something like this because it's quite a lot of work for them. But we can say we can help you. There's a lot of evidence base there. And I think it's a really exciting and innovative idea. It's true that MPSs haven't been used in this way. So far they've been used in a rather more conventional way, but there's no reason why they can't be. And I think we just need government to be a bit imaginative and throw their weight behind the concept. That's me done.